Hello, everybody. Welcome to the panel on mythology in tabletop role-playing games. Glad that you are joining us. If you're on the Discord, we are over in Toast A. That is where you can keep an eye on the chatter among the people who are listening to it, and also that is going to be where you ask your questions. I will ask that you hold the questions until we approach the point at which I'll start looking for those, because otherwise I may miss them in the chatter on Discord, and then I won't know that you had asked it. We're going to follow the usual format here. I'm going to ask my fellow panelists to introduce themselves. We'll talk a little bit amongst ourselves, and then roughly at maybe like 15 minutes before the end of this, I will start looking for those questions in Discord. So let's start off with the introductions. Strix, would you like to go first?
Hello, I'm Strix, and today I'm a villain with her villainous cat.
That is a beautiful cat.
This is my kitty Thane. So hey folks, it's good to see all of you on a Sunday. Thanks for deciding to spend time with us. My name is Strix, and I am a project narrative director at Hidden Path Entertainment, where I am heading up a AAA Dungeons & Dragons video game. My master's degree is in mythology, with an emphasis in Jungian depth psychology, fascinating subjects. I was originally in the PhD track, but I decided I wanted to actually make money off my thesis, and my thesis ended up being Bluebeard's Bride, which is my award-winning tabletop RPG based off of the fairy tale of Bluebeard, and is feminine horror, and is very horrifying. So I live and breathe mythology every single day at my job, and I continue to do research, publish peer-reviewed papers, et cetera, on the relationship between mythology, psychology, and play.
All right, and Arthur.
Yeah, hi. I'm Arthur. I am primarily an illustrator, graphic designer, but I have recently spent the last year and a bit working on a tabletop game inspired by tarot that has kind of its own mythology based on the world that is set out within those original Rider-Waite-Smith cards. So I don't have like a formal qualification in mythology, but I've been interested in it my entire life. I think a lot of us are. It's kind of just it gets into your brain real little. Yeah, that's kind of where I'm coming from.
All right. And I am Marie Brennan, best known as the author of the Memoirs of Lady Trent, but for the purposes of this, it's a little more relevant that I do some amount of game writing, especially for the game Legend of the Five Rings, which is heavily based on Japanese history and mythology and so forth. And in some ways it's done well by that, and in some ways it really hasn't. We'll probably wind up talking about that. And I also have the academic background in folklore. I did my undergraduate degree in archaeology and folklore, and then graduate school in cultural anthropology and folklore. I was actually studying role-playing games for a while I was doing that. Wound up leaving without completing my PhD, so I don't actually
Very smart. Yep, me too.
I mean, there's a part of me that's still like, I wish I had something to show for those years, like some piece of paper, but I don't. But yeah, so I also have looked at this stuff, analytically, as well as using it in my writing, both for fiction and, pertinently for this panel for games. And so there's a couple of different angles that I'd like us to discuss here. I want to start with just sort of what the mythologies are that we're using in these games. And take a look at both using real things and then inventing something for a game. And actually, Arthur, since you mentioned that you're working on something based on tarot, let's start with that then. What are the considerations that come to mind for you when you're taking something that exists in the real world and saying, okay, now I want to do a game thing with this?
Yeah, well, with the tarot in particular, there's a little bit of more leeway than you would with a more religion kind of a thing, because it isn't like, well, it's obviously a thing that people respect and believe in some way, it's not a like culture. So there's kind of a less of a appropriation thing that you ever have to deal with, but there is, there's accepted ideas that are part of this that you want to bring into whatever you're working on. That like if you handled something to do with the High Priestess card in a way that was not really respecting the intent behind it, it wouldn't have the same impact. And that's, you want to, I think just research, like, you want to know as much as you can about whatever you're bringing into it when it's
Yeah.
an existing thing.
Yeah, I sometimes feel like, if you're going to do something that's based on tarot and then you say, okay, this is the high priestess thing, and then you proceed to ignore everything to do with the actual card and its significance, then I start going, why did you bother? Like, if you're not going to use this, then why bring it in? And I think sometimes the answer is just, ooh, it lends a bit of like recognizability, but then sometimes it honestly does feel like the authors, when it's done badly, were, I'm going to go ahead and say, lazy, that they didn't feel like doing the work to look into something beyond maybe the most shallow level, and that can be deeply disrespectful. Yeah. Um, since I said I work for L5R, I'll note the game, actually, just as a brief history, it was developed for a number of years by Alderock Entertainment Group, AEG, and then it got sold off to Fantasy Flight Games, FFG. Uh, and Fantasy Flight rebooted a bunch of things about the setting. Oh, we have, okay, hopefully we will get Strix back here. I didn't know if, 1 second, are you back with us?
Yes,
Yeah,
I'm
okay.
back. I'm so sorry. We had a surge and all of my power went out.
Oh my
Technical
gosh.
difficulties happen, okay.
But I'm back.
So we're talking right now about using real world things, and I was about to address L5R. Over the years, especially like as the game has evolved, the people involved in it have actually gotten more serious about doing the research and being respectful about things, which has made me very glad. Like, one of the things Fantasy Flight did after they acquired it was say, hey, how about if we're going to use Japanese words, we use them correctly, which AEG hadn't done. And I'm like, okay, that's a good move. But I wish they had been a little bit more radical in their reboot, because one of the points of friction with the game, very justifiably, is that it uses the names of some real world kami from Shinto, but it doesn't use them in the way that they exist in Shinto. Like Amaterasu, the kami of the sun, the myth that is sort of like the big important thing founding the setting is basically Kronos and Rhea from Greek mythology. It involves her husband, who's this invented figure, swallowing their children, and like the whole story that you see in Greek mythology. And that wouldn't bother me as much if they didn't use the name of a real world kami. Like, don't do that. If you're going to completely replace the mythology with something foreign, then use a different name, right? Don't have it be this thing that is a real world article of faith for people. Strix, I already had Arthur chat about the tarot stuff and sort of the considerations there. Do you have any thoughts on using real things and kind of what you need to watch out for?
So the question is using real world mythology in tabletop products?
Yeah, in RPG, I mean, in fiction generally, but specifically here, RPG contexts, like, what are the considerations that you need to bring to mind?
Yeah, so we're in a unique position in the United States to have all of the power of Western imperialism behind us. So it's complex. So I really deeply believe in cultural borrowing. Cultural borrowing is how cultures evolve, and that is different from appropriation. Like they are two distinct things for me. And I want to encourage everyone listening to this panel and maybe watching it later to like engage with cultural borrowing. Like if it's not your gods and it's a mythological thing, like yeah, consider using it. But that does mean that you need to take the extra steps of educating yourself. So that means, to me, most importantly, reading primary texts. So that means texts that are actually the myth. As close to the source that you can get. And then if you're reading secondary texts, it's secondary texts written from people who belong to that culture or who are descendant from that culture. Though, a lot of things change. And then really tertiarily, some white dude scholar from Oxford, if you really have to.
Which unfortunately sometimes that's
sometimes you really
available.
have to. Yeah. But I use mythology every day in my work. And it's not that I'm like, today I'm going to incorporate Cronus. It's today I'm going to incorporate the archetype of the father who eats the children, right? Or today I'm going to work with the trickster. So there are certain, I'm going to say this word and I'm not going to really mean it, universalities to mythology in the way that archetypes work. But you have to understand that each culture interprets those archetypes differently, that they have different values and they're contextualized really differently. So like the trickster in, West African mythologies is really different from the trickster in Siberian mythologies. They're both the trickster. They're, quote, universal, but you need to take the time to understand the differences and to value them.
Yeah, that's the flaw with like a lot of people are aware of Joseph Campbell's work, but he was he was very much somebody who was looking for those universal ideas, and in the process of so doing tended to kind of let all of the particulars fall by the wayside. So
Marie, if you want to get me to rant, just unleash me on Joseph Campbell. I swear to God.
Yeah. And I mean, I will say, like, reading somebody like Campbell can be sort of fruitful for feeding the brain, but I wouldn't take it as your roadmap for talking about things in the real world. And so this is my, ever so graceful segue into talking about inventing things for game purposes. Where do you start, and what are the things that you want to have when you're creating a mythology for a game world? I don't know if that's something Arthur, you said you're working on a tarot thing. I don't know if you've done anything with inventing particular mythologies.
Yeah, I with this particular setting, because I wanted it to be very much based on only kind of the information that we have in the cards and from Arthur Waite's book, because I wanted it specific to that original iconic deck.
Yeah.
So I didn't do too much like specifics. I didn't come up with like particular folk tales that would exist in this world or anything like that. But I did want to kind of interpret some of the figures that worked best as not quite a god, but a god in that way. So I have like a sort of semi-pantheon within this setting that's with the moon, the sun, the devil, death, and what was the other one? And the world is the other one that I used. Because they're cards that have a figure on them that don't necessarily match a landscape, and that's kind of why I picked them. But yeah, I think in terms of creating something from scratch as a mythology, I really wanted to think about like the fact that mythologies are sets of stories, but they're primarily created as part of a religion, and that comes with cultural concepts like what do they value, what are their customs, what celebrations and festivals come with this religion and stuff like that. That is kind of not necessarily where I ended up including specifics like that in there, but I wanted to think about it from the start to go, how does this become a god in a mythology, and not just a folktale?
I like that because I feel one of the places where games often kind of fall down on this sort of thing is they'll come up with, okay, here are the gods and here's what they do. And they don't get those customs and festivals and like the lived reality of, all right, if this is a religion that people practice, what does that mean? I rarely get the feeling of it being that kind of textured thing that actually is a meaningful aspect of people's lives. It's more just kind of like a set of details that gets plunked down in a sidebar or something. Strix.
Yeah, so I build cosmologies and pantheons from scratch, like for work professionally, and I take it in stages. So my personal underlying philosophy is that myths are stories we tell to ourselves about ourselves in order to understand who we are. Like that's what mythologies are for. And so I start with a psychological model. And I go, okay, if I'm creating a pantheon, what I'm really looking for are archetypes and gods that reflect one piece of humanity, one type of person, or one type of aspect of like who humans are, because the gods are reflections of us. And so usually, like I end up at like the core of like 12 or 13 gods that I usually need for that kind of thing. And they represent archetypes like the mother or the innocent or the lovers or the trickster, one of the staples. And I make sure that I kind of like have the full spectrum of human expression within the pantheon. So that I know like if I need to talk about death, this god is going to be that area. And if I need to talk about fecundity and sex, then this god has that covered. Like the aspects of humanity that are going to need to be interpreted through these gods. Then I take the next step of putting them in the world and associating them with values like Arthur does. and starting to tie like human foibles and misunderstandings like to the gods. And that means like how do these people interpret them, and how do they interpret them well and also wrongly within their own culture? And then I mix that up with food and water, because those are things that are essential to everyone, and there are a lot of myths about food and water. And then I just kind of go from there. So it's like psychology, foibles, food and water. Okay, build the whole rest around it.
Mm. Um, So I've never been in a position of actively designing a mythology for a game. The work that I've done has always been with, existing IPs and such. The closest I've come is like creating a few additions onto an existing system because I need them for the story I'm writing. But I like what you say about archetypes. Certainly one of the values of using that, especially in something like a game, is that that's going to be something that is recognizable to the players. And so it's fairly easy for them to grasp hold of. They go, okay, this is, trickster, I have a sense of what tricksters are like. This is mother, I have a sense of what mothers are like. Because I certainly think when you look at real world religions, you can find plenty of things that don't necessarily slot quite as easily into those things. Like you would have to dig a lot more, do a lot more analysis to settle on that kind of explanation. But in a game, like in a novel, you have the time maybe to do a lot of exposition and to explore the ideas behind the religion. The game, you usually need to hand people something that's a little more user friendly, where they don't need to read 20 pages before they can understand how this works. The thing that I find that I'm getting sort of increasingly irritated by, and I'm about to bag on D&D, so Strix has already warned me, no comment, cannot comment in any fashion on this. But the way that I see mythology, or rather religion, gods, that kind of thing, being presented in D&D, in Pathfinder, and so forth, these days, like I don't find it interesting because it's fallen into this very clear pattern where it's like, okay, here is a god, and here's their portfolio with their different domains that they rule over, and here is their holy symbol, and here is their holy weapon, and we're going to give like one festival, and here are the countries where that god is worshipped, and it's all just so like regimented and clean and very artificial feeling. And I warned my fellow panelists I was going to rant a bit about the handling of evil gods, because the way D&D gives it to you, it's like, okay, Pathfinder, Urgathoa is the goddess of disease. And so Urgathoa's followers are like, yay, disease, we want to infect people with things because disease is wonderful and like it should rule over the world. Like, that's not how people tend to interact with that kind of thing in real religion. Evil deities are something that are not necessarily evil, like that's not even the word you would use a lot of the time, but malevolent, wrathful, dangerous things. You worship them to propitiate them, to say, please do not turn your wrath on me. And so you're trying to like forestall that kind of thing, rather than it being, oh, and we have this entire country that worships this evil god. Yay, evil. It drives me up the wall. So that's the rant, and I see Strix is keeping a very good poker face there.
I can say nothing at all. I can neither confirm nor deny.
But so part of the problem you run into when you have this very like artificial, very clean cut, very systematized, everything gets slotted nicely into place, is you lose the numinous feeling. So the next question I want to look at is, gods should theoretically be something that feels otherworldly, feels way more than human. It feels like its power is just on another level entirely. And though humans can do things to try and control what the gods do, of like, oh, if I make an offering, perhaps you will do this thing for me. It's never a like, okay, put coin into slot, get thing out, at least not in real religion. So how do you keep the feeling of the numinous in a context where, by the nature of it being a game, it has to be systematized and fairly like predictable, like maybe randomized, there might be dice, but there's still a clear thing of here's how it all works. How do you keep that numinous feeling?
Well, so I'm not sure that I agree entirely with the case being made.
Okay.
So numinosity, numinous is one of my favorite words, and numinosity is something that's really important to me. But I do think that there is also a value in down and dirty gods, in small gods,
Yeah.
and in not like overarching divinity. We've been using the term religion a lot, and I want to reframe that as like belief system.
Okay.
Everybody has a belief system, whether they're atheist or religious or spiritual or whatever it is. Like our human brains are built literally to be metaphor processors for belief systems. So we all have some kind of system. And so interrogating those systems, to me, is a big joy of doing RPGs. So for Bluebeard's Bride, for example, which again is based off of the fairy tale of Bluebeard, and is about a woman exploring his mansion as horrible things happen to her. The mythological structures are really close to you, like they're too close to you, like they're panting in your ear, and that's the point. You know, when you're trying to maintain numinosity, you have to have a certain amount of ineffability, which means an unknowingness, right? Too big to encapsulate, like you said. But sometimes if you break it down into little pieces, that can be the most powerful thing of all, in my experience. So, fisticuffs.
What exactly do you mean by break it down into little pieces?
I mean, break gods down into little
Okay.
pieces. I mean, make them knowable.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, certainly I will agree with you that like the extent to which the gods are knowable versus, you know, more ineffable, that varies between different belief systems. You know, it's not like every culture has had the same notion of how transcendent the gods are. Since I've seen people are talking about Greek mythology a bit in chat, there's a blog that is I've been just recommending everywhere because it's my blog crush these days. It's called A Collection of Unmitigated Pedantry. It went around the internet.
That sounds fun.
Yeah. It's fantastic. I recommend it to people. It went around the internet last year because the guy running it did a military analysis of the Siege of Gondor in both the books and films of Lord of the Rings.
I love it.
Because he's a military historian. He's an academic historian. But he understands that, you know, there's lots of things that you can't just look at war in isolation, and so things like religion absolutely feature in. And he did a series of posts a while back, which I found when I went and read his entire archives, that were about polytheism in the ancient classical world, and especially like basically Greece and Rome. And one of the things he talked about was how very transactional religion was in that kind of setup. And the reason why it made sense to have something like a deified emperor was because the gods were thought of in terms of being sort of part of the community, just a part of the community that was probably very distant from the individual person. You would never really get to see them, but they have a lot more power than you do. And you can make an offering of like, hey, if I sacrifice a ram to you, then will you do this thing for me? Well, at that point saying, hey, emperor, if we build a temple in your honor, will you like reduce our taxes for the next 10 years? That sounds a lot like the same interaction that you just had with a god. You know, it's a difference of degree rather than kind. So I'm not going to claim that, you know, all of these things need to be numinous and ineffable. But that's one of the things that I like about this sort of thing. So I'm always interested in the question of how you create that. Arthur, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think I mean I kind of agree with like I very much agree with both of these. I think it depends a lot on intent. Like there's a lot of interesting things you can do with both kind of constructions. But if you're like with a lot of the D&D ones where it does feel a little bit hollow sometimes unless in your own homebrew setting you're adding more to it. I think where it falls flat is it's not being broken down and simplified and structurified, for lack of a better word, in a purposeful way where that's the point. It's being done for the sake of the mechanics. And even that is kind of loose. Like there's no real mechanical reason that Umberlee has to be chaotic evil.
But that's the underlying philosophy of the
right.
the setting or the entire cosmos, basically, is you've got that alignment system.
Right. And so you run into a lot of it where it almost just feels like reskinned Greek mythology, where it's like, this is the chaotic god of the ocean. This is the evil god of the dead. And it's like, you could do that if you're doing it on purpose.
Hades is sitting there going, I get the worst rap.
Exactly.
So I think this is a case of ludonarrative dissonance. Also one of our favorite words for game designers. So
I can tell you were in academia.
Oh yeah. So what Arthur pointed out is actually really important in that if you want to maintain numinosity of certain gods with certain tones and feelings and psychological psychic stuff within them, you actually have to do honor to that through your actual mechanics. If your mechanics are divorced from the feeling and tone of how you want this to be delivered and work, you get Ludo, right? Play, story, narrative, dissonance, disharmony. And so if you're making a mechanic and you want it to interface with a part of your mythology or numinosity or your god, you can't just be like, and it gives you +2 when you pray. That doesn't build the feeling for you. You know, mechanics are a way of delivering narrative, are a way of delivering feeling. And if you want to deliver feeling about numinosity, you got to make sure your mechanics are in line. And actually, that's what I think one of the issues with tabletop D&D in particular.
I agree with that. The thing that I think, and I'm pretty sure I got this from the blog The Angry GM, so credit to there. But I think one of the ways of dealing with this involves leaning on a mechanic that people often don't even think of as a mechanic, which is the GM. The GM is a fundamental mechanic of most games. There are some that are, GM-less. But that is one of the things that there's all kinds of stuff in a game where you say, well, there's not a written rule for this, because, God, we've seen the tabletop games that try to write a rule for everything, and some people like that. I don't particularly. So when there isn't a rule for something, the mechanics say the GM decides. There's your mechanic. And so I think if you want to have that feeling of the numinous, the thing that is not just yes, I make this roll and I get a +2, there we go, that's my religion, then part of it may need to lean on the GM being the person who is being that ineffable, maybe not entirely controlled, maybe it will show up when you don't expect it and, muck around with your life. And it's important to bear in mind, speaking of, kinds of dissonance that can happen, whether or not the group of players that you have are the kind of people who like certain things that they go, okay, well, that's outside the scope of what's written down in the book, and the GM may decide to do things in a less predictable fashion. Some players are fine with that, and some players really, really aren't. So it's important to know what the group is looking for and be clear about what type of game it's going to be. Like, if it'll be the sort of thing where this blurs over interestingly into magic, obviously, because especially in a game like D&D, you've got your arcane casters, you've got your divine casters, and pardon me, it's really hard to make divine magic feel like anything more than put coin into slot, have result come out. You may have variability in like how many hit points you heal, but you're always going to heal something when you cast that spell. And I've had discussions with people about the difficulties of designing for something where, doing magic, whether it's of a religious type or not, depends more on things like, are you sufficiently in harmony with your god, or something like that. Because people don't want, most of the time, the high variability of like, oh, well, my abilities may not always work. Sometimes they're just going to go away, and I need to do stuff to get them back. And you wind up with stuff in D&D like the atonement spell, where it's basically, oh, like do some deed and then make a roll, and there you go. You have fixed everything and you are back and right with your god, and it loses, again, that feeling that I want. See, I think it's difficult to do this within a mechanical framework unless you lean on the mechanic that is the, loose and flexible one of the GM. Strix, I know you wanted to talk a bit more about like using this kind of mythological stuff to, feed the game itself, not just as, all right, here's part of the setting and here's how people interact with it, but like the narrative that's created and kind of having that follow mythological lines.
I'm not sure I understand the proposition here.
Just when we were talking briefly before we started, you said that you wanted to, I mean, maybe you've already hit that with talking about archetypes and such, but, using myth on the narrative level rather than on the setting level of like shaping the narrative of a game around mythology.
Sure. So I think most tabletop games lean on archetypes. D&D does it, Pathfinder does it, almost anything you can think of. Now that's because archetypes are like contained little packets of information that are really dense, that's easy to communicate between people. So we use them a lot. So really, one thing I want you to be curious about as you listen to this panel is like, are you are you doing little plays of little gods yourselves when you're running around as like this archetypal hunter or this archetypal wizard or this archetypal any kind of character in your world? And I come from a scholastic tradition working with live mythologies, so living mythologies of current and relevant cultures, not just like the dead myths of the Greeks who have been beaten to death like a dead horse. And the thing about living mythologies is that they change and that meanings shift. And so
they're messy.
it's super messy and also like very powerful. And so when you're playing in your tabletop game, you are in fact enacting a living mythology yourself. You're occupying the archetype, you're exploring that psychological space, you're interacting with other archetypes. Like what you're doing is magical, like with the K maybe. Uh, you know what I mean? And so I think you treasure the experience, but also like the more that you consume and explore outside art, so like the classics or TV or reading books or whatever it is, the more you'll actually get a sense for like your own mythologies and like what values are mythologized in your world and what's interesting and new or what's old in a blind spot. So I think mythologies and the practice of mythology is very powerful. And I think you do it almost every time you pick up an RPG, and I don't feel like we talk about that a lot. So I'm just gonna put that out there.
One of the things that I actually wrote about when I was in graduate school, there's a book by an anthropologist named Victor Turner called From Ritual to Theater.
Yep, I have it on my bookshelf.
Yeah, and so he talks about the differences between ritual and theater. And when I was reading through this for I don't remember which class, I looked at it and went, oh, RPGs are actually ritual, according to the way that he's looking at it, because the idea of the differences, like, with theater, you have the performers and you have the audience, and there's this separation between them. But within a ritual, basically everybody who is participating in the ritual is both performer and audience for other people's performances. And you look at an RPG and go, especially I was looking at live action role-playing games at that point. I'm like, wow, this really does, fit that model.
Backgrounds are very similar.
And so, yeah, there is a clearly a kind of like, academic scholarly, we're getting pretty highfalutin here, but sense in which, yeah, in maybe not in a religious, spiritual sense, but you are enacting kind of a ritual when you are doing this sort of thing. So, yeah, you sent me off down that rabbit hole.
Yeah. Did you ever read Maya Deren's Divine Horseman?
No.
You should do that, and the audience should do that too. So Maya Deren's Divine Horseman is a book about voodoo practices in the Caribbean, and it's really accessible. It's not written for academics. But I actually used that text in my own work, comparing the ritualism of mythology with possession, essentially. Not in the scary Catholic sense, but in the like archetypal, like there's a power within me that is extra, that is numinous, bringing it all back sense. And I'll link my academia.edu papers where I talk about that, but it is,
yeah, please do.
For you folks at home, like people are thinking about this, and we are seeing relationships between playing RPGs and having actual numinous experiences. The power is there.
Arthur, do you have anything you want to toss in on that?
It's kind of gone into an area that is a little more academic than is like it's very interesting, and I'm having a great time listening. But I don't have a lot to add here. That is going to be it's going to be a little bit more casual. But it is kind of making me think about just one of my favorite uses of mythology, which is a particular. It's kind of not in a gaming sense, but in the Agent of Asgard comic series from Marvel. That it was focusing on Loki, but a lot of the kind of way they used the mythology in that particular run handled it in the sense that these characters that are based on gods are creatures of story. They work in the sense of the narrative that they're supposed to be. They fulfill their narrative roles, and that's why they have the power they do. It's not hugely related. It just kind of made me think in that direction. It's a way of handling mythology that I haven't seen very often in a mainstream media source, and I really liked it.
Yeah, that's really cool.
So the other thing this has made me think of is on the level of like mythological narrative structures, rather than it being a specific character necessarily, more the shape of a particular story. let's go ahead and, because Campbell's an easy target, or rather a familiar thing to reference. Lots of people have now heard of the hero's journey, right? Which he's not the only person to have come up with a structure for that. I used to have a book that actually like listed or, went into several different people's analysis of this kind of structure. But there are other, kind of narrative structures you could point at. I think there's an interesting potential tension between wanting to kind of create a structure like that in your game and say, okay, I want to have, do something that's going to have the feel of this, when you're doing it in a context where theoretically it is about like player agency and the players should be able to go in the directions that they want to go in, which might or might not match the structure that you have in mind. And so this is where gamers wind up in arguments about railroading and so forth. And I don't think they're necessarily incompatible things, but some of it comes back again to that question of making sure that the players have bought into what it is that you want to do. Because the reason that I was doing a bunch of stuff on LARPs when I was in grad school was because I was involved in a really great ongoing LARP at the time. And they would do special event games every once in a while where it would just be a one shot that, like, one of them was, okay, there's a time travel convention. Like, they're going to award one patent for a time travel device for all of time itself because, prior art, you got to have the only patent for it to be the first patent. And it was like everybody just took every single trope of time travel you can imagine and threw them all into one game. Or there was another that was like 1940s Hollywood black and white, or one that was an anime thing of like, okay, take your characters, your usual characters, and what would they be in an anime universe? And I think that when players know this is the target we're aiming for, then they may be, much more willing to sort of point their agency in the direction of this is what we're trying to do, or they'll just say, I'm not particularly interested in that. But you can also design a game to facilitate that. There's one that I got reminded of the other day, which I need to go take another look at. It's called Aegon, and it is supposed to be creating basically, this is a game for playing a Greek tragedy. Do not try to use it for anything else. It is not a flexible game that you can use to do many things, but if you want to play out a Greek tragedy, here you go. The game is here for you, and it has mechanics built to create that feeling. I don't remember what those mechanics are because I haven't looked at that book in a decade. At this point, we're at about 15 minutes, a little bit less away from needing to end. So I'm going to say, people who are hanging out in the Discord, feel free to start tossing your questions into there. And while we wait for the questions to appear, do either of you know of any other games that do a good job of designing toward a particular kind of narrative like that?
So that's my expertise. I really don't like designing universal system games. I like playing them.
Yeah.
But as an artist and a designer, I usually set out to make you feel very particular things. Hall of Vista was all about nostalgia and overcoming like self-doubt and tragedy. Bluebeard's Bride was about the terror of being a woman. And I very laser focused on delivering those experiences. So, I think in the indie tabletop RPG space, this is kind of a given that like you design to the particular thing that you want to do. There's not many folks creating universal systems these days. And you do that through mechanics, right? Ludonarrative harmony, and you do it through the storytelling that you do in your prose with your book. And it's also how you market it, and it's also about your own brand. There's a lot of things that go into that. But I firmly believe that every game is not for every person. Like this game, it doesn't have to be for you. And that is totally fine. And when you do that, you give yourself the strength as a creator to make, I think, more exacting games, more precise games that really deliver those things. And as a player, like, you should look for those games too. Like, if you know you want a certain thing, don't try to shove it into, Pathfinder. Like, find the game that has done that. And there's hundreds and thousands of indie games, so I'm pretty sure you can find one.
Arthur, do you have any you recommend?
It's hard to name like specific ones. I have really enjoyed a lot of the I'm trying to remember the company's name. Is it Rowan and Rook? They do Spire. But they also do all these monthly one-page games.
Mm.
And some of them are kind of on the funny side, like Honey Heist, of course. But then there's several of them within that catalog that are a little bit more serious. And they're just these really simple one-page games that you don't have to think a lot to figure out how to play. But they give you this very specific little structure for a little micro-narrative. And they're great, and I recommend all of them, even the funny ones. But I have really enjoyed the serious ones.
I think my sweet spot on the like very specifically designed to the universal spectrum is actually in the middle. Because like although I talked earlier about its flaws, I really do love Legend of the Five Rings. I wouldn't write for it if I didn't. And it's not a game that you can use to run everything. Like you cannot use it to run your like, Steampunk Wild West game, for example. But it has a great deal of flexibility within the kind of milieu that it has set for itself so that you can do a game that is very much the like war focused thing, or you can do something that's about the courtly politics or whatever. So that's where my personal sweet spot is. So looking at some questions that have come in, one that might be aimed specifically at Strix. Are you familiar with Glorantha, myth-heavy setting for RuneQuest, King of Dragon Pass, 6 Ages? In-game, there's a monomyth, which is a useful tool to analyze deities, but is ultimately wrong. More generally, I find clearly false theories can be useful in a game. They might be more fun than in the real world. Is this something to lean on?
Yeah, okay, so let's just unpack Campbell and monomyths for a second, and I promise to keep my lid on. You have to understand that like Joseph Campbell and the hero's journey is like actually why I got into liking mythology. Like he's accessible, he says really interesting stuff, and that's fine. Like I respect like at my university, I had a scholarship and I was a Joseph Campbell Scholar. That was the title of the scholarship. I had access to his Opus archives at Pacific Graduate Institute. So I don't want to make out like he's a villain. He's not. The problem is scholarship has not moved on from Campbell in the mythological realms of academia since that stuff came out, and it is heavily flawed. It privileges Western worldview, which is a big problem. It privileges masculine and male worldview, which is a big problem. And the thing about the monomyth is it's kind of a stretch. Like it actually doesn't work out when you analyze it properly. And so while it is a good way, a lens to sometimes use to mess with things and to look at them, it cannot be the only lens and it cannot be your default lens. And that's actually the problem. And that's what I take umbrage with as both a scholar and someone who works in the industry is there's a problem in Hollywood. Where this guy named Vogler took Joseph Campbell's monomyth stuff, turned it into a formula, and said, "This is how you make money." Done. And the problem is formulas don't work. They don't work. When you create stories that way, they're horrible and soulless and grotesque, and it has damaged storytelling in our media for decades now. It has crowded out non-Western narratives. It has crowded out feminine narratives about women and how they are heroes and how it's different. And so when I take umbrage, it's all this damage continues to be done because we can't move forward from where Campbell started us. And so I try to tear down the monomyth every time I see it for that reason, not because I dislike Campbell. Campbell's work was foundational, but because we really, really got to move on now.
And we need to move on in ways like I saw, I can't remember what the title of the book was, but somebody recently was talking about a book that basically was like, here's the monomyth from the feminine side. I'm like, we don't need a monomyth. Like, that's not the solution to the problem.
Yeah, it's like structural poisoning on the way we think. We actually need to engage with different structures.
So we got another question here. Is there a game you'd recommend that has a good way of blending multiple mythologies together? I'll answer that briefly because my answer is very simple. I don't know of a good one. Like the only games I can think of that actually do engage with there are multiple different mythologies here are basically D&D and its relatives, where it's all built onto the same underlying framework of we've got our axes of alignment and everything's going to be slotted into one of those. The end. I don't know of a game that does a good job of having like genuinely separate mythologies and dealing with kind of the interactions between those. I don't know if either of you do.
I can't think of any, but I'm not super familiar with a lot of indie games. I keep up as much as I can. I can't think.
So 13th Age
I
kind
will
of comes to mind.
find.
Uh-oh, author's go,
Arthur, you still there? Nope, then I got a little warning sign. Well, hopefully we will get them back. Carry on, Strix.
So I haven't looked at 13th Age in years. This is maybe incorrect information, but maybe 13th Age. But in terms of like, if we're talking about clashing belief systems, i.e. clashing pantheons or ways of believing things, I feel like I must know some indie games. Hey, you're back!
Good, okay.
There we go. For a moment, I wasn't sure if we were able to hear you.
We're still rooting around for answers to this question.
I mean, let's say that it's a difficult thing to answer in general because in the real world, if somebody says, okay, how do you reconcile these different mythologies and say, how do they interact if they're both true? That's a difficult theological question. I'm not surprised that it is a difficult thing to answer satisfyingly in a game context.
Yeah, I imagine you'd want to look for magical realism genres. And indie games that might get you to where you are wanting to go with that.
Yeah, and I mean, there's nothing saying you can't have that in a game, but it's going to work the most smoothly, I think, the more the game doesn't try to like interact directly with the fundamental truth of the cosmos. If it's just, here are these cultures and here's what they believe, then those can interact just fine. That's not a problem. But the more you start being, and now the divine is a thing that characters can like interact with and, call to help them, then you start needing to have an answer for, all right, if two people who, worship different gods that cover the same thing, like what happens when those hit?
Yeah. I think if your game is about that, then it can do it really well.
Yeah, probably. And that's like you said, there's so many indie games out there that have hit so many, fascinating little like niche angles. There probably is a game that has addressed exactly this, and I don't know it because I no longer live in Indiana and go to grad school there and go to Gen Con and buy things in the dealer's room on the theory that someday I will use this in a paper that I'm writing, which might be where rather a lot of my gaming book collection came from.
Yeah, and I think a lot of in terms of trying to make multiple mythologies fit within one world but still feel distinct, I think in terms of working with that as a game, you want to make the mechanics of how those mythologies interact with your characters and your setting, you want to make those mechanics slightly different. But in terms of practicality, that gets complicated to actually learn and physically play the game. So with a lot of smaller games, it's just not really possible to do unless it is the point of the game. With a bigger one, it'd be doable, but I haven't seen it.
That's definitely, like you said, wanting to have different mechanics, and going back to what Strix brought up before of having the mechanics support the feel you're trying to create. That is the difficulty that I have seen on just kind of a structural level with games, that if you want to have even just different kinds of, let's say arcane magic, take the divine out of it for a moment. The problem is either they all fundamentally run on the same structure of you've got your spell slots and the spells are of the different levels and you have to prepare your spells at the beginning of the day or else you're a spontaneous caster. Those are the two models we've got. That they try to bring in something of like, okay, well, there will be, let's say, Pathfinder alchemists and there will be witches, and fundamentally alchemists and witches still feel like everything else with a very thin paint job slapped on top. But if you try to design fundamentally different mechanics, you can easily start running into problems of these things don't play nice together. So it is challenging to make that work. We got one more question here, and then we'll need to wrap up. Who are your favorite real-world deities, and have they influenced the games you work on?
Yes, of course. Of course they have.
Do you want to name a specific one?
I mean, for me, the OG, right, is Hecate,
Okay.
which was my first personal goddess as a baby witch, like in my teens. She's a chthonic goddess, which means having to deal with the underworld. And I find myself drawn to a whole variety of chthonic gods, just because of who I am. But they inform a lot of what I do, a lot of how I like kind of gestate. My creativity has some archetypal flow with how chthonic deities do things in the unconscious and the subconscious of our minds, and below the surface. So yeah, she's my girl.
All right, Arthur.
Yeah, I also had a, a teenage witch phase. I was very, very enamored by Persephone. I've also always liked Loki. Um,
Hmm.
in terms of I like Alia Arcana, which is my tarot game, is my first game that I've put together. So I it doesn't hasn't really come into anything of that. It might have influenced maybe how I put together the moon. Could be kind of Persephone-esque.
Hmm.
Um, but it definitely has influenced my other work. My first comic project was directly what if Persephone was a superhero. So
Nice. If I had a patron deity, it would probably be Athena, because I have to say, wisdom and war sounds like just kind of a nice combination. I can vibe with that a little bit. But I also have a soft spot for Loki because I got introduced to him by Diana Wynne Jones' novel 8 Days of Luke, and so I can never really
I
quite
haven't read that
believe
one.
in Loki as like actually bad. Like, no,
Yeah.
he's just misunderstood. That's really not true.
I was about to say, be careful.
Yeah, I totally recognize that.
That's how
Well,
you have horse babies.
yeah, we are at 12:50, which means that we need to end this. So I want to thank my fellow panelists for their excellent thoughts, and thank all of you who were listening in and chatting in Discord. We hope to see you elsewhere soon.
Where can we find you online?
Oh, good call. I am at swantower.com or swan_tower on Twitter. Arthur.
I am at the One Kierce.
Okay.
That's Kierce.
We can pop this into the
Common
Discord
name,
chat as
so
well.
yeah.
Strix.
And I am the_Strix, STRIX, on Twitter.
All right.
Okay, thanks, folks.
Thank you all very much. Bye.
Bye.